Family Guy seems like a mindless cartoon on the surface, just a big dumb guy doing big dumb things in a fictional Rhode Island town while his baby tries to take over the world and his dog drinks martinis. But fans have been digging through over 25 seasons and more than 450 episodes of this show, and what they've found hiding underneath all the cutaway gags and fart jokes is genuinely disturbing. From dark explanations for why the characters never age, to horrifying reasons behind Meg's abuse, to theories that suggest the entire show is happening inside a broken man's mind. These fan theories will completely change how you see Family Guy forever. In this video, we're going to explore the most disturbing Family Guy theories and figure out which ones actually hold water. Some of these come from deep Reddit threads. Some come from patterns that fans have noticed over 2 decades of watching this show. And some of them are backed up by things the creators themselves have said or done. Either way, once you hear them, you won't be able to watch Family Guy the same way again. Make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Alright, let's get into it. Let's start with what might be the single most devastating Family Guy theory ever created. This is the Peter Griffin mental institution theory. And honestly, if this one turns out to be true, it changes literally everything about the show. So the theory goes like this. What if the entire world of Family Guy, every episode, every cutaway, every insane adventure is happening inside Peter Griffin's head while he sits in a mental institution? What if his family's dead and the show is just his psychotic delusion? Here's how the theory breaks down. According to the original version posted on Reddit, the real story starts with Meg, but not the Meg we know from the show. In reality, Meg Griffin was actually a beautiful, popular teenage girl. She was at the prime of her high school life, well-liked, attractive, the kind of girl who had everything going for her. She also had a deep, genuine love for her younger brother Chris. And here's the tragic part. Chris didn't get enough oxygen when he was born, which resulted in a mental disability that he dealt with his entire life. Meg had a special bond with Chris because of this. She couldn't stand the fact that her brother couldn't receive the same love and attention that she got from everyone else. So one night, Meg took Chris to a party. She wanted him to have a normal teenage experience, the kind of night that most kids take for granted. But Meg drank too much at the party, and when Chris started having a panic attack, she decided to drive him home. She was too drunk to drive. She crashed the car. Both Meg and Chris died in the accident. Think about that for a second. Peter lost 2 of his children in a single night because his daughter made one terrible decision. But it gets worse. Lois was pregnant with a 3rd child at the time, a son they were going to name Stuart. Unable to cope with the grief of losing Meg and Chris, Lois took her own life while she was still carrying Stewie. Peter lost everyone. His daughter, his son, his wife, and his unborn baby. All of them gone. According to this theory, Peter couldn't handle it. He completely snapped. And in his broken, grief-stricken mind, he created a world where everyone was still alive. That world is Family Guy. Now here's where it gets really messed up, because this theory actually explains almost every weird thing about the show. Let's start with the most obvious one. Why does everyone in Family Guy treat Meg like garbage? Peter is cruel to her. The family ignores her. Characters go out of their way to humiliate and abuse her for no apparent reason. If you take the show at face value, it's just a running joke that doesn't make much sense. But if Peter is in a mental institution imagining all of this, it makes perfect sense. Peter still resents Meg on some deep subconscious level. She was driving the car. She was the one who drank too much. In Peter's mind, Meg is responsible for destroying his entire family. So even in his fantasy world, he can't help but punish her. But here's the thing that makes this theory heartbreaking, instead of just dark. Every once in a while, Peter shows genuine compassion toward Meg. There are moments scattered throughout the series where he's actually kind to her, where he protects her, or tells her He loves her. Those moments represent the part of Peter that still remembers who Meg really was. The beautiful, caring girl who loved her brother so much that she died trying to take him home safely. Part of Peter hates Meg for what happened. Part of Peter still loves her. And that internal conflict plays out across hundreds of episodes. Now let's talk about Stewie. In the show, Stewie is a 1-year-old baby who speaks with a British accent, builds time machines, creates ray guns, and plots to take over the world. None of that makes any sense for an infant. But remember, in reality, Stewie was never born. Lois died while she was still pregnant with him. Peter never got to meet his youngest son. He never got to see what Stewie would become. So in his fantasy, Peter imagined Stewie with unlimited potential. He made Stewie the smartest person in the room because Peter, desperately, wanted to believe that his unborn son could have been extraordinary. Every invention Stewie builds, every genius moment he has, is Peter's way of saying my son could have been something incredible. And why does Stewie want to kill Lois? That's one of the most famous running gags in the early seasons. Stewie is obsessed with matricide, with killing his own mother. If Peter is imagining all of this, Stewie's hatred of Lois represents Peter's subconscious anger. Lois killed herself while pregnant with Stewie. In Peter's twisted, grieving mind, Lois took Stewie's life. She robbed him of his chance to exist. So the fictional Stewie hates the fictional Lois because the real Lois is the reason the real Stewie never got to live. Then there's Brian. Brian is the family dog who talks, writes novels, drives a Prius, dates human women, and serves as the voice of reason for the entire household. He's also the character who sounds exactly like Seth MacFarlane's natural speaking voice. In the theory, Brian represents the intelligent, articulate man that Peter always wished he could be. Peter isn't dumb in reality. He's a grieving father who retreated into childlike behaviour because the adult world destroyed him. Brian is the part of Peter's mind that still thinks clearly, still reasons through problems, still tries to make sense of a world that stopped making sense the night his family died. That's why Brian is always the one trying to ground Peter, trying to pull him back from his worst impulses. Brian is Peter's own intelligence, projected onto the family pet. Now, what about Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe? According to the theory, these are real people who exist outside of Peter's delusion. Cleveland and Quagmire actually lived in Peter's neighbourhood before the accident. They visit him in the mental institution, and their visits get incorporated into Peter's fantasy world. That's why they show up in so many episodes, but can also disappear for stretches without explanation. When they're absent from the show, they simply haven't visited Peter in a while. Joe is particularly interesting. Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer, is actually someone who moved into Peter's old house after the family was gone. Peter never met Joe in real life. Cleveland and Quagmire told Peter about their new neighbour during their visits, and Peter built a character around the description they gave him. That's why Peter imagined Joe as this heroic, strong, devoted father and husband. Joe represents everything Peter wished he could have been. A man who faces impossible obstacles but never gives up on his family. A man who stays committed no matter what. Joe is Peter's idealised version of the father he failed to be. The theory even explains the Cleveland show. Remember when Cleveland got his own spin-off series? He moved to Virginia and started a new life. In the context of this theory, Cleveland was visiting Peter so frequently that he started losing his own grip on reality. He was being drawn into Peter's delusion. The Cleveland show represents Cleveland's own parallel fantasy, one that he eventually snapped out of when the show was cancelled and he returned to Quahog. There's actual episode evidence that supports pieces of this theory too. In the Season 8 episode April in Quahog, a news report announces that a black hole is going to swallow the Earth within 24 hours. Everyone in Quahog panics and tries to live out their final day, in what he believes are his last moments alive. Peter confesses something devastating to Lois. He tells her that he secretly hates being around his own children. When the black hole turns out to be an April Fool's prank, Peter has to spend the rest of the episode trying to win back his kids' love. But here's the thing. If Peter is in a mental institution, that moment of brutal honesty might be the real Peter bleeding through his fantasy. For just a second, the delusion cracked and the truth came out. He resents his children because in reality, they're the reason his life fell apart. There's another moment in the episode Lottery Fever where Peter directly says, and this is an actual quote from the show, he tells Chris to try as hard as he can, but that he'll never be as good as his older brother who died. Peter says he had a son who died. The show treats it like a throwaway gag, but within this theory, it's Peter's subconscious slipping through again. He did lose children, and somewhere deep in his broken mind, he can't stop that truth from surfacing. The most devastating part of this entire theory is what it means for the show as a whole. Every joke becomes a coping mechanism. Every cutaway gag is Peter's fractured mind jumping between random memories and fantasies. Every absurd storyline is a man in a mental institution trying desperately to build a world where his family's still alive, still together, still happy. Even the show's floating timeline, where nobody ages and nothing has permanent consequences, makes sense. In Peter's fantasy, time doesn't move forward, because moving forward means accepting that his family's gone. If this theory is true, then every single episode of Family Guy is the delusion of a grieving father. Every laugh, every stupid Peter moment, every Stewie invention, every Brian lecture, all of it is happening in a room in a mental hospital, while a broken man tries to hold on to the people he lost. And that is genuinely one of the most heartbreaking fan theories in television history. That theory is devastating, but let's move on to something that might explain one of the show's biggest mysteries. Why can Brian Griffin talk? Most people just accept that Brian is a talking dog and move on. It's a cartoon, right? Dogs talking cartoons. But here's the thing. In Family Guy, other animals don't talk. Regular dogs in the show behave like regular dogs. Cats act like cats. The only animal who functions as a full human being is Brian Griffin. He writes novels, he drives a car, he has political opinions, he dates human women, and he drinks martinis at the bar with his friends. No other animal in Quahog does any of this. So what makes Brian different? The Brian Griffin CIA experiment theory offers a genuinely terrifying answer. According to this theory, Brian has a human brain that was surgically implanted into a dog's body by the Central Intelligence Agency. And before you dismiss that as completely insane, there's actually a surprising amount of evidence for it. The key piece of the puzzle comes from American Dad, Seth MacFarlane's other animated series. It's been established multiple times that Family Guy and American Dad exist in the same universe. Characters reference each other. There have been crossover moments. The shows share a creator and a connected fictional world. And in American Dad, the CIA routinely conducts experiments that put human minds into animal bodies. Klaus, the Smith family's pet goldfish, is actually a German Olympic ski jumper whose brain was implanted into a fish by the CIA. This is confirmed within the show. It's not a theory, it's canon. Reginald, a koala who appears in American Dad, is another CIA experiment. The technology exists in this shared universe, and the CIA uses it on a regular basis. In American Dad Season 5, the episode Brains, Brains and Automobiles actually shows the CIA's mind transfer technology on screen. Stan Smith uses it to swap minds with different bodies. So we know the technology works, we know it's been used on animals, we know the CIA has access to it, and we know that Brian Griffin exists in the same universe where all of this is happening. Now think about Brian's origin story within Family Guy. We've been shown flashbacks of Brian as a puppy, and here's what's really telling. Brian was the only puppy in his entire litter who behaved like a person. His brothers and sisters were normal dogs. They barked, they played, they acted like puppies do, but Brian was different from the very beginning. He could talk, he could reason, he showed human-level intelligence before he even left his litter. That doesn't just happen naturally, even in a cartoon. Something was done to Brian before the Griffin family ever found him. And then there's the issue of Brian's son, Dylan. Brian fathered a child with a human woman, and Dylan is fully human. Not half dog, not some hybrid creature, a regular human teenage boy. If Brian was just an ordinary talking dog, his biological child should have canine DNA. But Dylan is completely human. The only way this makes biological sense is if Brian himself has human DNA, specifically a human brain and human genetics that were implanted into a canine body. Seth MacFarlane uses his natural speaking voice for Brian, not a character voice, not an exaggerated cartoon voice, his actual voice. Every other main character in Family Guy is performed with some kind of vocal affectation. Peter has that Rhode Island accent, Stewie has the British thing, Quagmire has his distinctive delivery, but Brian just sounds like Seth MacFarlane talking normally. This is because Brian is essentially a human man. He sounds like a person because he is a person, just one who's been trapped in the body of a dog. The deeper horror of this theory is what it means for Brian's daily existence. If he's a CIA experiment, then Brian is essentially a kidnapped human being who was forced to live as someone's pet. Think about that. He has a human mind, human emotions, human desires, but he's stuck in a body that society treats as an animal. He can't fully participate in the human world. He can't have normal relationships. He can't be taken seriously as a writer or an intellectual, because at the end of the day, he's still a dog to everyone around him. This would explain so much about Brian's personality. His alcoholism isn't just a character quirk. It's a man self-medicating to cope with the existential nightmare of being trapped in the wrong body. His pretentiousness and constant need to prove he's intelligent isn't ego. It's a desperate attempt to be recognized as the human being he actually is. His failed novels, his failed relationships, his chronic depression, all of it makes sense when you realize he's a person who can never fully be a person. In the landmark episode, Brian and Stewie from Season 8, which aired commercial-free with no cutaway gags and focused entirely on Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault, Brian reveals that he keeps a loaded gun in his safety deposit box. He tells Stewie it's for the day when things get too bad, when he can't take it anymore. That's not a joke. That's a man who has been contemplating ending his own life because the reality of his existence is unbearable. Brian's death in Life of Brian, Season 12, Episode 6, and his subsequent resurrection via time travel in Christmas Guy, 2 episodes later, shows just how essential he is to the show's fabric. The show literally could not function without him. The family fell apart, fans revolted, the writers had to bring him back almost immediately. If Brian is a CIA experiment, a human consciousness trapped in a dog, then his death wasn't just losing a pet, it was losing a person, and everyone in the show, and everyone watching it, felt that on a level they couldn't quite articulate. The CIA experiment theory turns Brian from a funny talking dog into one of the most tragic characters in all of animation. He's a man without a body, a human being without human rights, and nobody around him, except maybe Stewie, truly understands what he's going through. Brian's existence might be a government cover-up that nobody in Quahog will ever uncover, but the next theory suggests that the whole show might be seen through completely different eyes than we think. What if everything we're watching in Family Guy is being filtered through the perception of a 1-year-old baby? This is the Stewie perception theory, and it might be the most elegant explanation for every weird thing that happens in Family Guy. The basic idea is simple. What if the entire show, every episode, every cutaway, every impossible event is just how an infant named Stewie Griffin perceives the world around him? What if the real Griffin family is actually pretty normal and all the insanity we see is a baby's brain trying to make sense of a reality it doesn't fully understand. Think about the most obvious piece of evidence first. Who can understand Stewie when he talks? This is one of the most inconsistent things in the entire show, and it drives fans crazy. Sometimes characters hear Stewie and respond to him directly. Other times, they completely ignore him, as if he's just babbling. The show has never given a clear answer for this, but the Stewie perception theory explains it perfectly. In reality, Stewie can't talk at all. He's a baby. He babbles like babies do. The conversations we see Stewie having are his internal thought process projected outward. When characters seem to understand him, it's because they're reacting to his crying, his pointing, his facial expressions, the way babies actually communicate. When they ignore him, it's because his words are just baby sounds that adults tune out. Brian is the most important character in this theory, because Brian can always understand Stewie. They have full conversations, they go on adventures together, they're best friends. But why would a dog understand a baby when most humans can't? Because young children personify their pets. Every kid who has ever grown up with a dog has held full conversations with that animal in their imagination. They project human thoughts and speech onto their pet because the pet is their companion, their friend, their protector. Stewie talks to Brian because that's what babies and toddlers do with animals. Brian doesn't really speak. Stewie just imagines that he does. Now look at how the other characters are portrayed through this lens. Peter is big, clumsy, childish, and kind of dumb. That's exactly how a baby would perceive their father. Dad is this giant figure who breaks things, makes loud noises, watches TV all day, and doesn't seem to understand anything important. Peter's cartoonish stupidity isn't his actual personality. It's how a 1-year-old interprets adult male behaviour. Lois is strict, controlling, and sometimes scary. She's the one who feeds Stewie, changes him, disciplines him, puts him to bed when he doesn't want to go. From a baby's perspective, that's an adversary. That's someone who controls your entire life and won't let you do what you want. Stewie's desire to kill Lois in the early seasons isn't literal villainy. It's a baby's frustration with the parent who has total authority over his existence. Every infant rages against the person who tells them no. Stewie's weapons and schemes are just the baby version of a tantrum, amplified through his extraordinary imagination. Meg is an older teenager who fights with her parents, slams doors, and deals with high school drama. To a baby watching all of this, Meg would seem like a miserable, hated person, because the only interactions Stewie witnesses between Meg and the family are arguments, eye rolls, and dismissal. Babies can't understand the context of teenage family dynamics. They just see the negativity. So in Stewie's perception, everyone hates Meg, because from where he's sitting, it looks like they do. Chris is the sibling who's closer to Stewie's level. He's simple. He's kind of dopey. He watches cartoons and eats snacks. To an infant, an older brother like Chris would seem harmlessly dumb because babies can't appreciate the difference between adolescent behaviour and actual stupidity. The cutaway gags, which are the signature element of Family Guy's comedy, suddenly make perfect sense in this theory. Babies don't have linear thinking. Their minds jump from stimulus to stimulus, associating random images, sounds, and ideas with no logical connection. That's exactly what a cutaway gag is. Someone says something, and suddenly we're in a completely different scenario that has nothing to do with the plot. It's a baby's brain making random associations, jumping between memories and fantasies the way infants process the overwhelming flood of information around them. One potential problem with this theory is the show's constant references to 1980s pop culture. Stewie was born in the late 1990s at the earliest. How would a baby know about He-Man, Transformers, Reagan-era politics, and classic rock? But fans have actually found the answer to this one. In several episodes, Stewie is seen playing with vintage action figures, specifically Lion-O and He-Man toys. These are clearly hand-me-downs from Chris or even Peter. Babies absorb information from everything around them. If Peter watches 80s movies and Chris has old toys lying around, Stewie's perception of the world would naturally be coloured by decades of pop culture he's been exposed to through osmosis, even if he doesn't truly understand any of it. The strongest evidence for this theory comes from the show itself. In the 300th episode, Send In Stewie Please, Stewie sits down with a child psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield. This episode is unlike anything else in Family Guy history. There are no cutaway gags, no other characters appear except through brief mentions. It's just Stewie in a room, talking, and what he reveals is extraordinary. Stewie admits that his British accent is fake. He drops it entirely during the session, speaking in a normal American child's voice. He tells the therapist that the accent is a facade, a character he created to cope with feeling like an outcast. He admits to plucking his own hair from anxiety. He discusses his sexuality with surprising vulnerability. He even briefly considers letting his true self emerge before retreating back into his constructed persona, because being ordinary terrifies him more than being fake. This episode proves that Stewie consciously constructs a fictional version of himself to navigate the world. If his accent is an invented coping mechanism, what else about his reality is invented? The weapons, the time machine, the world domination plots, all of these could be elaborate fantasies that a genius-level infant creates to feel powerful in a world where he has absolutely no control. The darkest moment in that episode comes at the end. The therapist begins to have a heart attack. Stewie watches him struggle, and instead of getting help, he lets the man die. Why? Because Dr. Pritchfield saw through the facade. He glimpsed the real Stewie underneath all the performance, and Stewie couldn't allow anyone to know the truth about who he really is. He tells Brian that night that he's done something awful, but refuses to elaborate. He killed the only person who ever saw him clearly, just to protect his invented identity. If this theory is true, then the real Family Guy is actually just a normal, somewhat dysfunctional family in Rhode Island. Peter works a blue-collar job. Lois raises the kids. Meg deals with being a teenager. Chris is a regular kid. And Stewie is a baby, sitting in his high chair or lying in his crib, watching the chaos of family life unfold around him and interpreting all of it through the wildest, most elaborate imagination any infant has ever had. Every explosion, every time travel adventure, every talking dog conversation is a baby making sense of a world he doesn't yet understand. And the show we're watching isn't reality. It's how one extraordinary child perceives reality. That's either beautiful or deeply unsettling, depending on how you look at it. What if it's not just Stewie's perception that's off? What if the entire town of Quahog is something much darker than a Rhode Island suburb? Let's talk about this really dark theory that's been circulating for years. What if Quahog isn't a real town at all? What if it's purgatory? What if every character in Family Guy is already dead, and they're trapped in an afterlife where they're forced to confront their sins for all eternity? Every animated show with a long enough run eventually gets an everyone is dead theory. The Simpsons has one, SpongeBob has one, Rugrats has one. But the Family Guy version is weirdly convincing, and the reason it works so well is because of how the show actually functions on a structural level. Think about the most fundamental rules of Family Guy. Nothing ever changes, not permanently. Characters can die and come back. Buildings can be destroyed and rebuilt by the next episode. Relationships can be shattered and repaired without any lasting consequence. The characters never age. The kids never grow up. Peter never gets promoted or fired for good. The status quo always resets. Most people chalk this up to the nature of sitcoms. Shows need to return to a baseline, so each episode works independently. But purgatory theorists argue there's a darker reason. Nothing changes in Quahog because the characters are in a spiritual holding pattern. They're trapped in a cycle of repetition because they haven't learned the lessons they need to learn. They haven't earned the right to move on. Look at how each character is punished by their existence in Quahog, and the purgatory framework starts making uncomfortable sense. Stewie Griffin is an evil genius with unlimited intellect, but he's trapped in the body of a helpless infant. He can build time machines and ray guns, but he can't feed himself, can't drive, can't reach the top shelf. He has the mind of a supervillain and the body of a 1-year-old. That's not a character, that's a punishment. Brian Griffin is a self-proclaimed intellectual, a writer, a philosopher, someone who desperately wants to be taken seriously as a thinker. But he's a dog. No matter how many novels he writes or political arguments he makes, he's still a pet. People literally rub his belly and throw him treats. He'll never be treated as the person he believes himself to be. That's a punishment. Lois Pewterschmidt came from one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter, is a billionaire. She could have lived a life of luxury, comfort, and social status. Instead, she married Peter Griffin and ended up in a loveless, chaotic, money-strapped existence where her husband destroys everything she builds and her children are various shades of dysfunctional. She traded paradise for Spooner Street. That's a punishment. Peter wants more than anything to be taken seriously. He wants respect, admiration, success. Instead, he's universally regarded as a buffoon. Every scheme fails, every dream collapses. He's the joke of every room he enters, and he lacks the self-awareness to understand why. He's trapped in a cycle of humiliation that never ends. That's a punishment. Meg is the most obvious case. She desperately craves love, acceptance, and belonging. She gets none of it. Her family openly despises her. Her classmates bully her. She's the universal punching bag of Quahog. And no matter what she does, she can never escape that role. In one season 10 episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg actually stands up for herself. She goes off on every member of her family, calling out years of abuse with surgical precision. She dismantles each of them, and then, in the most devastating moment in the entire series, she voluntarily takes it all back. She returns to being the family punching bag because she realizes they would fall apart without someone to absorb their dysfunction. In Purgatory, that's a soul who recognizes her test but chooses to fail it anyway. Chris wants to be smart. He wants to be noticed. He wants to matter. Instead, he's dim-witted, overlooked, and forgettable. He's the least discussed member of the Griffin family, both in the show and among fans. He's punished with invisibility. The theory argues that Stewie's character arc across 25 seasons is actually evidence of purgatorial progression. In the early seasons, Stewie was a straight-up villain. He plotted to murder Lois. He wanted to conquer the world. He was pure wrath and ambition. But over time, he softened. He's developed genuine friendships, especially with Brian. He's shown vulnerability, compassion, even love. If Quahog is purgatory, Stewie might actually be progressing through his punishment. He's learning to be a better soul. He's earning his way towards something higher. Lois, on the other hand, is going the opposite direction. In early seasons, she was the moral centre of the family, patient, kind, reasonable. But over the years, she's become increasingly selfish, manipulative, and cruel. In purgatorial terms, she's failing her test. She's getting worse instead of better, which means she's moving further from redemption, not closer to it. The Dar Boom episode from Season 2 adds another layer to this. In that episode, Y2K causes a nuclear apocalypse. The world is destroyed. Stewie mutates into a tentacle monster. Society collapses. Then at the end, it's revealed to be a dream. Or is it? Some theorists argue that Dar Boom actually happened in the Family Guy universe, and everything after that episode is the afterlife. The characters died in the nuclear holocaust and woke up in purgatory, but they don't know they're dead. The dream explanation is just the afterlife's way of resetting the narrative so the dead souls don't realise what happened to them. The cutaway gags take on a new meaning in this framework too. If the characters are dead souls in purgatory, the random, disconnected cutaway flashbacks could be residual memories from their previous lives, fragments of experiences bleeding through from the world they used to inhabit. The reason the cutaways feel disjointed and surreal is because they're not real memories. They're distorted echoes of things that happened to people who are no longer alive. One version of the theory even casts Brian and Stewie as something other than regular souls. Some fans think they might be demons or wardens assigned to keep watch over the Griffin family. Their job is to ensure the Griffins face their tests and aren't released until they've learned their lessons. Brian's temporary death in Season 12 would then be interpreted as him getting fired for failing to do his job. Vinny, the replacement dog, was his temp. When Stewie used time travel to bring Brian back, it was essentially a cosmic rehiring. If Quahog is purgatory, then every episode of Family Guy isn't a comedy. It's a morality play. The characters aren't failing at life because they're cartoon characters. They're failing at redemption because they refuse to grow, refuse to change, refuse to confront the worst parts of themselves. And the show's eternal reset button isn't lazy writing. It's the nature of the afterlife itself. Nothing changes because they haven't earned the right to change. Be sure to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying the video so far. Now let's move on to a theory that'll make you look at one of Quahog's most famous residents in a completely different way. You ever really think about Glenn Quagmire? Like, really think about how impossible this character is? Quagmire's age has been stated inconsistently throughout the series. Some episodes suggest he's in his 40s, others put him well past 60. His driver's license has shown birth dates that would make him impossibly old, yet he never ages. He never slows down. He never faces any physical consequences for the staggering amount of damage he puts his body through. The Quagmire supernatural entity theory suggests that Glenn Quagmire isn't human at all. He's some kind of demonic being, specifically an incubus, a demon from folklore that's associated with sexual predation and seduction. And honestly, the more you look at the evidence, the harder it is to dismiss. Let's start with the obvious. Quagmire's sexual appetite isn't just extreme, it's supernatural. We're talking about a character who has slept with thousands of women, shows no signs of disease or physical breakdown, can seemingly seduce anyone he targets, and treats the entire process with an almost ritualistic regularity. His catchphrase, giggity, functions like some kind of incantation or trigger phrase. He says it before, during, and after every conquest. Normal humans don't behave this way. Even within the exaggerated world of Family Guy, Quagmire's sexual behaviour is treated as something beyond human norms. Look at his physical appearance. Quagmire's jaw is enormous, almost grotesquely oversized compared to the rest of his head. His chin extends further than any real human face could support. In folklore and mythology, demons are often depicted with exaggerated facial features, particularly jaws and mouths, because their appetites are literally larger than life. Quagmire's design might not just be a cartoon exaggeration, it might be a visual clue about what he really is. He survives things that should kill him. Getting beaten, blown up, crushed, shot at, Quagmire bounces back from physical trauma that permanently injures or kills other characters. Even Peter, who also survives a lot of abuse, doesn't have the same resilience. Quagmire's body seems to operate under different physical rules than everyone else in Quahog. If he's a supernatural entity rather than a human, this invincibility makes sense. You can't kill something that isn't alive in the traditional sense. His backstory adds further evidence. Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, is a former Navy war hero who came out as transgender during the series. His sister Brenda was trapped in an abusive relationship that Quagmire eventually resolved through violence. These are deeply human, deeply painful family situations. In supernatural lore, demons who inhabit the human world often create or attach themselves to traumatic family situations, because emotional pain gives them a connection to the mortal plane. Quagmire's tragic family history might be what anchors him to the physical world. His relationship with Brian is particularly telling. Quagmire openly despises Brian. He gave that famous rant where he listed every reason he hates the family dog, from Brian's pretentiousness to his failed writing to his treatment of women. But if Brian is a CIA experiment, a human mind trapped in a dog's body, maybe Quagmire senses something about Brian that other characters can't. Maybe Quagmire, as a supernatural entity, can detect that Brian isn't what he appears to be, and Brian's presence makes Quagmire uncomfortable because Brian is the only one in Quahog who might be able to see through his disguise. The residents of Quahog are strangely accepting of Quagmire's behaviour. He's openly predatory. He's been involved in situations that would get any real person arrested and imprisoned multiple times over. Yet the town just shrugs it off. People continue being his friend. Nobody permanently cuts ties with him. This passive acceptance is exactly what you'd expect if Quagmire is exerting some kind of supernatural influence over the people around him, a low-level charm or compulsion that prevents them from fully registering how dangerous he really is. In Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, it's confirmed that multiple parallel dimensions exist in the Family Guy universe. If the multiverse is real, there's nothing preventing entities from other dimensions from crossing over into the main timeline. Quagmire could be something that slipped through from another reality and embedded itself in Quahog, wearing a human disguise and feeding off the town's energy while everyone around him remains blissfully unaware. The scariest part of the Quagmire theory is that it reframes his catchphrase. Giggity. He's been saying it for over 20 years. Viewers laugh at it. It's on t-shirts and coffee mugs. But if Quagmire is a demonic entity, Giggity isn't a funny catchphrase. It's a predator's calling card. It's the sound a supernatural creature makes when it's about to consume its prey. And we've been laughing along with it the entire time. Quagmire might not be human, but the next theory suggests the show itself might be fundamentally different from what we've been watching all these years. Here's something that every single Family Guy fan has noticed, but most people never really think about too deeply. The show that came back after its cancellation is not the same show that got cancelled. And I don't just mean the writing got different or the animation improved. The characters themselves fundamentally changed. The entire vibe shifted, and there's a theory that explains exactly why. Family Guy premiered in 1999 and ran for 3 seasons before Fox pulled the plug in 2002. For 3 years the show was off the air entirely. Then, thanks to massive DVD sales and huge ratings on Adult Swim reruns, Fox brought it back in 2005 with Season 4. And from that very first revival episode, something was different. In Seasons 1 through 3, Meg was a normal teenage girl. She had problems, sure, but her family actually treated her with basic human decency. Peter was kind of dumb, but he was also a loving father who genuinely cared about his kids. Lois was the voice of reason, patient and kind and understanding. Brian was grounded and philosophical, genuinely wise in a way that felt earned. And Stewie was a bona fide supervillain, a tiny dictator with elaborate plans to kill Lois and conquer the world. Then the show came back, and everything flipped. Meg became the most hated person in Quahog, abused by literally everyone, including her own parents. Peter went from lovable idiot to genuinely cruel and destructive. Lois lost her patience and became selfish, manipulative, even predatory in later seasons. Brian transformed from a thoughtful voice of reason into a pretentious, insufferable, pseudo-intellectual that the show itself seemed to hate. And Stewie abandoned world domination almost entirely. becoming a flamboyant, vulnerable, emotionally complex character whose main relationship was his friendship with Brian. Most people explain this as flanderization, the process where writers exaggerate characters' traits until they become caricatures of themselves. And sure, that's part of it. But the multiverse theory offers a much more interesting explanation. What if the show that came back in 2005 isn't the same universe as the show that was cancelled in 2002? This isn't as crazy as it sounds, because the show itself has established that multiple parallel universes exist. In Road to the Multiverse, Season 8, Episode 1, Stewie literally builds a device that allows him and Brian to travel between alternate realities. They visit universes where Christianity never existed, where dogs rule over humans, where everything is drawn in Disney animation style. The multiverse is canon in Family Guy. It's not theoretical, it's confirmed. So here's the theory. The Family Guy that aired from 1999 to 2002 was Universe A. The Family Guy that returned in 2005 is Universe B. They look similar. The characters have the same names and live at the same address, but they're different versions of those characters from a different reality where everyone is meaner, darker, and more extreme. The strongest evidence for this comes from the Season 10 episode, Back to the Pilot. In this episode, Brian and Stewie travel back to the very first episode of the series, Death Has a Shadow. When they arrive in the past, they're shocked by how different everything is. Brian comments on the crude animation quality. They notice that the characters behave differently. The whole energy of the show feels wrong to them. Most viewers interpret this as a meta-joke about how the show has evolved. But if the multiverse theory is correct, Brian and Stewie didn't go back in time at all. They crossed into the original universe. They visited Universe A, and they were confused because it wasn't their reality. There's another piece of evidence that fans point to. In American Dad, which exists in the same fictional world as Family Guy, Stan Smith directly references Family Guy as a television show. He calls Brian his favourite fictional dog. If Family Guy's fictional within the American Dad universe, then maybe what we're watching isn't reality in any sense. Maybe the real Griffins exist in one universe, while the show version exists in another. The layers of reality become almost impossible to untangle, which is exactly what you'd expect from a multiverse where boundaries between dimensions are porous. There's even a chemical explanation that ties into this theory. In Season 5, Lake Quahog is shown to be massively polluted with industrial chemical waste. Real-world water contamination events, like what happened in Flint, Michigan, have been proven to cause cognitive decline, personality changes, and neurological damage in affected populations. What if the chemicals seeping into Quahog's water supply are what changed the characters? What if the polluted lake is slowly poisoning everyone in town, causing them to become more aggressive, more impulsive, more erratic? What if the cutaway gags that define the show are actually chemically induced hallucinations shared by an entire community drinking the same contaminated water? This would explain why Peter's behaviour has become increasingly dangerous and reckless over the seasons. Frontal lobe damage from chemical exposure causes exactly that kind of personality change. It would explain why Lois has become more selfish and less empathetic. Impulse control erodes when the brain is being poisoned. It would explain why Chris has become dumber. Developmental regression is a documented symptom of long-term exposure to certain industrial chemicals, and it would even explain why Stewie has mellowed out. Maybe the chemicals are actually dampening his extraordinary brain function, bringing him closer to baseline. The pollutants are making a genius more normal, while making normal people worse. Whether it's parallel universes or poisoned water, something fundamentally changed about the world of Family Guy. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every dark turn the characters have taken since 2005 starts to feel less like bad writing and more like evidence of something deeply wrong happening beneath the surface of Quahog. Speaking of things hidden beneath the surface, this next theory hits close to home. Very close to home. Because it involves one of the show's most uncomfortable running jokes and suggests a secret that would completely redefine the Griffin family. You ever notice how Meg and Stewie interact? Stewie is consistently crueler to Meg than he is to almost anyone else in the family. He goes out of his way to belittle her, humiliate her, and make her feel worthless. With Peter, Stewie is annoyed. With Lois, he's resentful. With Chris, he's mostly indifferent. But with Meg, there's something personal about his cruelty. Something that feels like it goes deeper than just a baby being mean to his sister. The Meg is Stewie's mother theory suggests that the reason for this deep personal animosity is because Meg didn't just grow up alongside Stewie. She gave birth to him. Here's the evidence. In the episode Partial Terms of Endearment from Season 8, which was so controversial that Fox refused to broadcast it in the United States, and it remains absent from all major streaming platforms to this day, only available on DVD, Lois directly states that Meg gave birth to Stewie. She says it plainly, as part of a conversation. Then she immediately tries to play it off as a joke, laughing it away. But the line is there. It was written into the script. It was recorded. It was animated. It made it into the final cut of the episode. And Fox was so uncomfortable with the implications that they banned the episode from American broadcast entirely. Think about that for a second. Of all the offensive things Family Guy has aired over 25 seasons, this is one of the episodes that was deemed too much for television. Not because of the A-plot about abortion, which is controversial enough on its own, but potentially because of what it reveals about the Griffin family's actual structure. Let's do the math. Meg is roughly 17 or 18 years old throughout the series, with her age floating depending on the episode. Stewie is perpetually 1 year old. If Meg became pregnant at 15 or 16, the timeline works perfectly. A teenage pregnancy would explain an enormous amount about how the Griffin family actually functions. In Season 3's episode Screwed the Pooch, it's established through a court case that Meg's biological father is not Peter Griffin, but a man named Stan Thompson. This is stated openly in the episode. It's not a theory, it's canon. Meg already has one massive family secret baked into the show's continuity. The idea that she might have another, that she's not Stewie's sister, but his mother, isn't some wild leap. It's consistent with the show's established willingness to hide dark truths about the Griffin family tree. Now think about why Peter and Lois would agree to raise Stewie as their own son instead of their grandson. Lois comes from the Pewterschmidt family, one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter, is a billionaire who already disapproves of Peter and thinks Lois married beneath her. If it came out that their teenage daughter had gotten pregnant, the scandal would have been devastating to the family's reputation. Peter and Lois might have agreed to claim Stewie as their own child to protect the Pewterschmidt name and shield Meg from public shame. But here's the cruel irony. Instead of being grateful to Meg for making this sacrifice, the family resents her for it. Every time Peter mocks Meg, every time Lois rolls her eyes at her, every time the entire family gangs up on their daughter, it's not random cruelty. It's a family punishing a teenage girl for a mistake that fundamentally disrupted their lives. They took on the burden of raising her child, and they've never forgiven her for putting them in that position. Stewie's treatment of Meg takes on a completely different meaning in this context. If Stewie, who is demonstrably a genius, has somehow figured out or sensed the truth about his origins, his cruelty toward Meg isn't random, it's deeply personal. He resents the woman who brought him into the world and then immediately handed him off to her parents. In Stewie's mind, Meg abandoned him. She chose to be his sister instead of his mother. She rejected the maternal role, and a genius infant would understand that rejection on a level that would create profound, lasting anger. Here's another detail that fans have noticed. Lois is never shown being pregnant with Stewie in any flashback within the main timeline. The show has depicted flashbacks of various events in the Griffin's past, but Lois carrying Stewie is conspicuously absent. It's as if the show is deliberately avoiding depicting something that never actually happened. Because in reality, it was Meg who was pregnant, not Lois. If this theory is true, it means the show's longest running joke isn't a joke at all. The family doesn't abuse Meg for no reason. They abuse her because she represents a secret that could destroy them. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment of cruelty is the family's way of keeping Meg in her place, making sure she never gets confident enough to speak the truth. They've turned her into the punching bag so thoroughly that she's internalized the role. She'll never tell the world what really happened because she doesn't believe she deserves to be heard. That's the darkest part of this whole theory. Meg could blow up the entire Griffin family's facade with a single sentence, but they've broken her spirit so completely that she'll carry the secret to her grave. The family didn't just take her child, they took her voice. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel if you're enjoying these theories. Now let's talk about something the show actually confirmed about its most mysterious character. We already talked about how the 300th episode revealed that Stewie's British accent is fake. But that episode goes so much deeper than just an accent, and the full implications of what Stewie reveals to Dr. Pritchfield are genuinely chilling when you start connecting them to the rest of the series. The Stewie dissociative identity theory argues that Stewie Griffin doesn't just have a fake accent. He has an entirely constructed personality that functions as a psychological defense mechanism against severe childhood trauma. The Stewie we've been watching for over 2 decades isn't the real Stuart Griffin. He's a character that a frightened, anxious child invented to survive a world that overwhelms him. In Send in Stewie, please, the 300th episode that aired in season 16, Stewie sits in a therapist's office for the entire runtime. No cutaway gags, no B-plot, no other characters except through passing mentions. Just Stewie and the doctor, talking. And what comes out of that conversation is devastating. Stewie starts the session performing. He's sharp, witty, deflecting every serious question with humour and intelligence. He's doing what he always does, playing the character, being the Stewie the audience knows. But Dr. Pritchfield is good at his job, and slowly, methodically, he starts peeling back the layers. He notices Stewie's strong opinions. He observes that Stewie is lonely, and when he says that word, lonely, something breaks. Stewie starts crying. Not the dramatic, theatrical crying he does in other episodes when he's playing for laughs. Real tears. Real. The tears of a child who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He admits that he's an outcast at his preschool. He doesn't fit in. Other children don't understand him, and he doesn't understand them. He confesses to pushing a student down the stairs, which is why he was sent to the psychologist in the first place. But instead of the cold, calculated violence we've seen from early season Stewie, this feels different. This feels like a scared kid lashing out because he doesn't know how else to express what he's feeling. Then the conversation turns to the accent. Dr. Pritchfield doesn't even need to point it out. Stewie brings it up himself, almost like he's been waiting for someone to ask, and when the therapist gently presses him on it, Stewie drops the accent completely. For the first time in the entire history of the show, we hear Stewie speak in a normal American child's voice. No affectation, no performance, just a kid. He explains that the accent, and everything that comes with it, is a facade, a coping mechanism. He adopted this persona because being himself was too painful. Being ordinary, being just another kid, being vulnerable, all of that was terrifying to him. So he built this elaborate character, the British accent, the genius intellect, the supervillain persona, the weapons, the world domination fantasies. All of it is armour. All of it exists to protect a scared child from having to face the world as himself. He even admits to plucking his own hair from anxiety. That's trichotillomania, a real psychological condition that's strongly associated with trauma, stress, and anxiety disorders in children. The show isn't playing this for laughs, it's presented seriously in a serious episode as a genuine revelation about who Stewie really is underneath the performance. For a brief moment during the session, Stewie considers dropping the act permanently. He imagines what it would be like to just be himself, to be a normal kid without the accent, without the genius, without the constant need to perform. And then he pulls back. He retreats into the character because the alternative is being ordinary. And being ordinary means being like everyone else. And being like everyone else means being vulnerable. Stewie would rather be a fictional version of himself than face the world as who he actually is. The ending of the episode is where the theory gets truly dark. Dr. Pritchfield begins having a heart attack during the session. This man, the only person who has ever seen through Stewie's facade and connected with the real child underneath, is dying right in front of him. And Stewie doesn't call for help. He watches, he lets the doctor die, because Pritchfield saw the truth. He glimpsed what's behind the mask, and Stewie cannot allow anyone to carry that knowledge out of the room. That night, Stewie tells Brian that he did something awful. He doesn't say what, Brian doesn't press him, but the audience knows. Stewie sacrificed the one person who truly understood him in order to protect the fictional identity he's built around himself. That's not a cartoon villain being evil. That's a traumatized child making a desperate choice to preserve the only version of himself he feels safe being. If you look at the entire series through this lens, Stewie's character arc isn't random writing changes. It's a psychological journey. In the early seasons, the Stewie persona was at full power. Maximum villain, maximum weapons, maximum aggression. He wanted to kill Lois. He wanted to conquer the world. Those are the fantasies of a child who feels completely powerless. The more threatened you feel, the bigger the fantasy you need to compensate. Early Stewie was terrified, so he built the most extreme version of his character to cope. As the series progresses, Stewie gradually softens. The world domination plots fade, the attempts on Lois's life become less frequent and eventually stop entirely. He develops a deep, genuine friendship with Brian. He shows emotional vulnerability. He lets people in. This isn't Flanderization or writers losing interest in the villain shtick. It's a child slowly, gradually healing. As Stewie forms real connections and starts to feel safer in his world, he needs the protective persona less. The armor gets thinner because the kid underneath is getting stronger. The weapons and inventions might all be imagined. The time machine could be a child's fantasy about having control over a world where he has none. The ray guns could be a baby's way of feeling powerful when everything around him feels overwhelming. We never see independent confirmation that Stewie's inventions work outside of episodes where he's the primary point of view character. Maybe they don't actually exist, maybe they never did. This theory turns Stewie from a one-note cartoon genius into the most psychologically complex character in animated television. He's a child actor performing a role 24 hours a day because the real him is too scared to come out. And the one time someone got close to meeting the real Stewie, that person died for it. Let's shift now from individual character analysis to something that affects every single person living on Spooner Street. Because the next theory argues that every resident of Quahog has been broken by something, and the show isn't a comedy at all. It's a slow-motion documentation of an entire neighborhood's psychological collapse. The Spooner Street trauma theory was originally laid out in detail by a Reddit user named DarkRabbit713, and it's one of the most thorough and well-argued fan theories in Family Guy history. The core idea is this: every main character in Family Guy has experienced specific, identifiable traumatic events throughout the series. And those traumas, rather than being played for laughs and forgotten, have accumulated over 25 seasons to fundamentally alter who these people are. The characters didn't get worse because of lazy writing. They got worse because that's what untreated trauma does to real human beings. Let's go character by character. Peter Griffin was abandoned by his biological father, an Irish drunk who was never part of his life. He was raised by his adoptive father, Francis, a strict, cruel, religious man who constantly told Peter he was worthless. In Season 5, Peter accidentally kills Francis when a unicycle he's riding runs over his father. He discovers that his real biological father is an Irishman he's never met. He also learns in a later episode that he wasn't even born in America. His mother went to Mexico to get an abortion, and Peter was born there instead. She never filed citizenship papers, making Peter technically an illegal immigrant. Layer on top of all this the constant humiliation Peter faces. The failed businesses, the injuries, the social rejection, and you have a man whose entire identity has been built on a foundation of abandonment, abuse, and lies. Peter's regression into childlike behaviour makes clinical sense. When adults face overwhelming trauma that they can't process, they sometimes revert to an earlier developmental stage where they felt safe. Peter acts like a kid because adulthood has given him nothing but pain. Every stupid thing he does, every impulsive decision, every reckless adventure is the behaviour of a man retreating from a reality he can't handle. Lois Pewterschmidt was born into one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. Her father Carter is a billionaire. She could have had anything. Instead, she married Peter Griffin, a blue-collar worker who can barely hold a job. Over the course of the series, we watch Lois slowly realise what she's given up. Her father's constant disapproval, her shrinking bank account, her children's dysfunction, Peter's inability to provide stability, all of it chips away at the woman she used to be. In the early seasons, Lois was genuinely kind. She was patient with Peter. She loved her children. She was the glue holding the family together. But as the traumas accumulated, her kindness eroded. She became more selfish, more impulsive, more willing to do things that the Season 1 Lois would have been horrified by. This isn't a character being rewritten. It's a woman breaking down. The increasingly cruel behaviour that fans criticise in later seasons is actually a realistic portrayal of what happens when someone's capacity for empathy gets exhausted by years of dysfunction. Brian Griffin was abandoned by his mother as a puppy. He grew up on the streets, fending for himself, before being adopted by the Griffin family. His entire adult life has been a series of failures. Failed novels, failed relationships, failed attempts to be taken seriously as a writer and an intellectual. In the landmark episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, which aired commercial, free with no cutaway gags, Brian admits that he keeps a loaded gun in a safety deposit box. He tells Stewie it's for the day when things get so bad that he can't go on. Brian's alcoholism, which is played for laughs throughout the series, is self-medication. His pretentiousness is overcompensation. His constant need for validation from women, from publishers, from his friends, is the behaviour of someone whose earliest experience of the world was rejection and abandonment. Every martini Brian drinks, every argument he starts about politics or literature, every woman he pursues who's clearly wrong for him, is Brian trying to fill a void that was created the day his mother walked away and never came back. Joe Swanson was a decorated police officer who was permanently paralysed in the line of duty. His wife Bonnie has attempted to leave him multiple times throughout the series, most notably during their trip to Paris, where she nearly started an affair with a French paraplegic. Joe compensates for his disability and his failing marriage with aggressive bravado, but underneath the tough cop exterior is a man who is deeply depressed and terrified of being abandoned by the only person he has left. Glenn Quagmire channels all of his pain into compulsive sexual behaviour. His father's transition, his sister Brenda's abusive relationship, which Quagmire ultimately resolved by killing her boyfriend. The loss of his mother figure, the absence of normal family structure. Quagmire deals with none of this through healthy processing. He deals with it through conquest after conquest, using sex the way Brian uses alcohol and Peter uses denial. Cleveland Brown was betrayed by his wife, Loretta, who had an affair with Quagmire, one of Cleveland's closest friends. That betrayal shattered Cleveland's trust in the people around him and led to a divorce that upended his entire life. He moved to Virginia to start over, tried to build a new family, and when that didn't work out, came back to Quahog carrying even more damage than when he left. Cleveland's calm, gentle demeanour isn't serenity, it's dissociation. He's checked out emotionally because feeling things has only ever led to pain. And then there's Meg. Meg Griffin is the most abused character in the entire show. Her family openly despises her. Her classmates torment her. She can't catch a break in any area of her life. But the most revealing moment in Meg's entire character arc comes in Season 10's Seahorse Seashell Party. During a hurricane that traps the family in their house, Meg finally snaps. She stands up and systematically dismantles every member of her family. She tells Peter exactly how terrible a father he's been. She tears into Lois for being selfish and negligent. She confronts Chris. She holds nothing back. It's the most cathartic moment in Family Guy history. After years of abuse, Meg finally fights back. But then something happens that's even more disturbing than the abuse itself. Meg takes it all back. She voluntarily returns to the role of family punching bag, not because she's scared, not because she's forced to, but because she realizes that without someone to absorb the family's collective dysfunction, the Griffins would destroy each other. She sacrifices herself to keep them together. That's not a punchline. That's a trauma response. Meg has been so thoroughly conditioned by years of abuse that she's internalized the belief that her suffering is necessary for the people she loves. She's become what psychologists call a family scapegoat, the person who absorbs all the negative energy so everyone else can function. And the most heartbreaking part is that she chose it. She didn't have to go back. She could have walked away, but she went back to the prison because she genuinely believes it's where she belongs. The Spooner Street trauma theory argues that the show doesn't get darker over the seasons because the writers are running out of ideas. It gets darker because trauma compounds. Each painful event adds weight to the one before it. The characters don't have therapists. They don't have support systems. They don't process anything. They just endure hit after hit after hit. And each one changes them a little more, pushes them a little further from who they used to be. By season 20, you're not watching the same characters you met in season 1. You're watching what's left of them after 2 decades of unresolved pain. The cutaway gags even make sense in this framework. Dissociation is a well-documented trauma response. When reality becomes too painful, the mind creates exits. It jumps to random memories, unrelated scenarios, anything to avoid being present in the moment. That's exactly what a cutaway gag is. The characters can't stay grounded in their own painful reality, so their minds constantly escape to disconnected, surreal scenarios. The cutaways aren't jokes, they're symptoms. Before we continue with more theories, make sure you've subscribed to our channel. Now let's talk about something that might be happening right underneath the characters' poik feet. We briefly touched on this idea earlier, but it deserves its own deep dive because the more you look into it, the more disturbingly plausible it becomes. The Lake Quahog contamination theory suggests that the reason everyone in Family Guy behaves so strangely, so recklessly, so disconnected from reality is because the town's water supply has been slowly poisoning their brains for decades. This isn't just a random fan idea pulled from nowhere. The show itself has established that Lake Quahog is heavily polluted. Multiple episodes reference the town's industrial contamination, toxic waste dumping, and environmental neglect. In one episode, the lake is shown to be so contaminated that it visibly affects wildlife. Peter and his friends have swum in, fished from, and consumed water connected to this lake throughout the entire run of the series. Everyone in Quahog drinks the same water. Everyone bathes in it. Everyone cooks with it. And the show has made it clear, repeatedly, that this water is not clean. Now here's where real-world science makes this theory genuinely frightening. We've seen what happens when communities are exposed to contaminated water over long periods. In Flint, Michigan, lead contamination in the water supply caused documented cognitive decline in children and adults. At Camp Lejeune, a Marine Corps base in North Carolina, decades of water contamination from industrial solvents caused cancer, neurological damage, and a host of behavioral changes in service members and their families. In Hinckley, California, the case that inspired the movie Erin Brockovich, hexavalent chromium in the groundwater caused serious health problems across an entire community. The symptoms of long-term chemical exposure to contaminated water include personality changes, increased aggression, impaired impulse control, cognitive decline, memory problems, and in severe cases, hallucinations. Now look at Quahog and tell me that doesn't describe every single resident of the town. Let's map the symptoms to the characters. Peter Griffin has become increasingly reckless, violent, and impulsive over the course of the series. In the early seasons, he was careless but relatively harmless. By the later seasons, he's causing catastrophic damage to property and people on a regular basis, often with no apparent awareness of what he's doing. That's consistent with frontal lobe damage, the part of the brain that controls decision-making, risk assessment, and impulse regulation. If Peter's brain has been slowly deteriorating from chemical exposure since the show began, his escalating behaviour isn't a character choice, it's brain damage. Lois has become more selfish, more erratic, and less empathetic over the seasons. In the early episodes, she was genuinely compassionate. She cared about her family. She made sacrifices, but year after year, that capacity for empathy has eroded. That's exactly what happens when the brain regions responsible for emotional regulation are compromised by toxic exposure. Lois isn't choosing to be cruel. Her brain is losing the ability to process compassion the way it used to. Chris has become progressively less intelligent as the series has continued. In the first few seasons, he was below average, but functional. He had moments of insight and clarity. As the show has gone on, those moments have disappeared almost entirely. Chris's intellectual regression maps perfectly onto the developmental damage caused by childhood exposure to neurotoxins. His brain never had a chance to fully develop because it's been bathed in contaminated water since before he was born. Stewie's arc is the most interesting when viewed through this lens. He started as a super genius with plans for world domination. Over the seasons, he's mellowed significantly. His inventions are less ambitious. His vocabulary is simpler. His plans are smaller. Most fans attribute this to character development, or writers softening the character for broader appeal. But the contamination theory offers an alternative explanation. The chemicals in the water are actually dampening Stewie's extraordinary intellect. They're bringing a once-in-a-generation genius down toward baseline. Stewie isn't choosing to be less ambitious. His brain is being chemically reduced. Mayor Adam West, played by the real Adam West until his death in 2017, was one of the most bizarre characters in Family Guy. He was paranoid, delusional, and made decisions that no rational person would make. He once declared war on a fictional country. He married a cardboard cutout. He believed he had superpowers. Fans always treated this as a character quirk, a cartoonish exaggeration of eccentricity. But if the water supply has been poisoning Quahog's residents, Adam West's behaviour starts to look less like comedy and more like a clinical presentation of severe neurological damage in someone who's been drinking that water longer than almost anyone else in town. The cutaway gags, which we keep coming back to because they're such a fundamental part of the show, take on yet another disturbing meaning in this theory. Shared hallucinations are a documented phenomenon in communities exposed to certain types of chemical contamination. When everyone in a population is being exposed to the same neurotoxin, they can develop similar perceptual disturbances. The cutaways in Family Guy might be shared hallucinations experienced by an entire town that's being slowly poisoned. Every character has them. They all seem to experience the same surreal, disconnected breaks from reality. That's not a comedy device. That's a toxicological symptom affecting an entire population. The theory also explains why nobody in Quahog seems bothered by the absurd things that happen around them. People get injured and recover instantly. Buildings are destroyed and rebuilt overnight. Characters commit acts that would be headline news in any real town, and their neighbours shrug it off by the next episode. That level of collective apathy isn't normal, even in a cartoon, but it's extremely consistent with the documented effects of chemically induced cognitive decline. When your brain is being damaged, you lose the ability to register things that should alarm you. Danger stops feeling dangerous. Chaos stops feeling chaotic. Everything just kind of becomes background noise. If Lake Quahog has been poisoning the town for the entire run of the series, then we haven't been watching a comedy about a funny family in Rhode Island. We've been watching the slow chemical disintegration of an entire community's collective sanity. And nobody in that community is capable of recognizing what's happening to them because the damage has already gone too far. From contaminated water to contaminated narrative, there's another theory that questions who's actually telling this story. Because according to some fans, the entire show might be written by one of its own characters. Brian Griffin has wanted to be a successful author for the entire run of Family Guy. He's written multiple novels, all of which have been critical failures. He's attempted screenplays, self-help books, and literary fiction. He's submitted work to publishers, entered competitions, and tried everything he can think of to get his writing taken seriously. The one constant in Brian's creative life is failure. Nothing he writes ever succeeds, or does it? The Brian is writing Family Guy theory argues that the show we're watching is actually Brian's magnum opus, the novel he's been working on this entire time. Within the fictional world of Family Guy, Brian has written the story of the Griffin family, and what we see every week is his manuscript brought to life. This might sound like a stretch, but the evidence is surprisingly strong. Let's start with the most obvious point. Brian appears in virtually every episode of Family Guy. Think about how unusual that is. The show has a massive cast. There are episodes centered on Peter's work, episodes about Meg's school life, episodes about Quagmire's relationships, but Brian shows up in almost all of them, even when there's no logical reason for him to be there. He's in the Road to episodes, the Star Wars specials, the Stewie-centric stories. He's everywhere. And when a character appears in every scene of every chapter, it's usually because that character is the one holding the pen. Consider how Brian is portrayed compared to everyone else. Brian is consistently written as the most intelligent, most reasonable, most morally grounded character in the show. He's the one who sees through Peter's stupidity. He's the one who calls out hypocrisy. He's the one with good taste in music, literature, and film. Yes, he has flaws. He's pretentious. He's an alcoholic. He fails at relationships. But even his flaws are the kind of flaws that writers give to protagonists they secretly admire. They're romantic flaws, artistic flaws, the flaws of a tortured intellectual. Meanwhile, every other character is drawn with much less flattering traits. Peter is an idiot. Lois is increasingly selfish. Meg is a punching bag. Chris is dim. Quagmire is a predator. That discrepancy makes total sense if Brian is the author. Writers always portray themselves more favourably than the people around them. It's human nature. Even when an author tries to give their insert character flaws, those flaws tend to be the kind that make the character more interesting rather than less likable. Brian's alcoholism makes him seem worldly and damaged. Peter's stupidity just makes him seem stupid. One of those characters is writing himself into the story. The other is being written about. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian using his natural speaking voice. Not a character voice, not an impression. His real voice. Every other character on the show is performed with some kind of vocal modification. Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, Carter, Tom Tucker. They all have distinct character voices that are clearly different from how MacFarlane actually sounds. But Brian just sounds like Seth talking. This has always been interpreted as MacFarlane using Brian as his personal avatar in the show. But if Brian is writing the show within the show, then the real-world author avatar and the fictional author are the same character. The layers of meta-storytelling become almost dizzying. Quagmire's famous rant against Brian makes a different kind of sense in this theory too. In that episode, Quagmire spends several minutes verbally destroying Brian, listing every reason he finds the dog insufferable. The pretentiousness, the failed writing, the treatment of women, the liberal posturing without follow-through. It's one of the most brutal character takedowns in animated television history. But if Brian is writing the show, this rant represents something fascinating. It's a character within Brian's own story, turning against the author. It's the creation confronting its creator and saying, I know what you're doing, and I don't respect it. The Inside Family Guy mockumentary episode plays with these meta-boundaries even further. Characters break the fourth wall. They reference the show as a show. They talk about ratings and storylines and their awareness of being fictional. Most shows that do this are just being clever, but if Brian is writing Family Guy, those fourth wall breaks are moments where his characters are becoming aware of the author's presence. They're sensing Brian on the other side of the page. Even Brian's chronic failure as a novelist takes on a new meaning. If he's been writing Family Guy this entire time, and if that writing has been consumed by millions of people for over 2 decades, then Brian hasn't failed at all. His magnum opus is the most watched animated show on Fox. His characters are cultural icons. His catchphrases are in the global vocabulary. Brian wanted to write something that mattered, and he did. He just doesn't know it because from inside the story, all he can see are the rejection letters from traditional publishers who don't realize he's already created something bigger than any novel. The most poetic aspect of this theory is what it means for Brian's death and resurrection. When Brian was killed in season 12, the show tried to replace him with Vinny, a new dog with a completely different personality. It didn't work. The fans revolted. The writers brought Brian back 2 episodes later through Stewie's time travel. If Brian is the author of Family Guy, then killing Brian was essentially the story trying to exist without its creator. And it couldn't. The narrative fell apart without the person writing it. Vinny was a placeholder, a temp narrator who couldn't sustain the world that Brian had built. Brian had to come back because the story literally cannot exist without him. Whether Brian knows he's writing the show or not, the evidence suggests that everything we watch is filtered through his perspective, his biases, his blind spots, and his desperate need to be the hero of his own story. Now let's shift into one of the most structurally elegant theories about Family Guy, one that argues the entire show follows a framework that's thousands of years old. The 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. These have been a foundational concept in Western theology and storytelling for nearly 2,000 years. Writers have used them as character blueprints since the Middle Ages. And according to this theory, Seth MacFarlane built every single main character in Family Guy around one of them. Let's start with the one that's so obvious it almost doesn't need explaining. Peter Griffin is gluttony. This is the easiest mapping in the entire theory. Peter eats constantly. He drinks at the Drunken Clam every single day. He consumes media, food, alcohol, and resources at a rate that defies physics. His body is literally shaped by excess, a massive gut that defines his silhouette. But Peter's gluttony isn't just physical. He's gluttonous for attention, for excitement, for experiences. He takes everything to excess because moderation simply doesn't exist in his operating system. Every impulse gets indulged. Every desire gets pursued. Every boundary gets crossed. Peter doesn't know when to stop because stopping requires a level of self-control that his sin will never allow him to develop. Lois Griffin is lust. In the early seasons, this was subtle. Lois was an attractive housewife with a healthy relationship. But as the series has progressed, her characterization has become increasingly sexualized and increasingly unfaithful. She's had affairs and near affairs with multiple characters over the course of the show, including Bill Clinton. In one episode, she worked at a strip club and clearly enjoyed the power that her sexuality gave her. Her relationship with Quagmire has been repeatedly teased, and in several episodes, she's shown being attracted to men who aren't Peter. In one of the Stewie time travel episodes, an alternate timeline shows Lois having left Peter for Quagmire entirely. Lois's lust isn't just physical, though. She lusts after the life she gave up. She lusts after the wealth and status of the Pewterschmidt family. She lusts after the excitement and passion that her marriage to Peter can no longer provide. Her increasing cruelty over the seasons can be read as the frustration of someone whose deepest desires are perpetually unfulfilled. She wants more than what she has, and the wanting is destroying her from the inside out. Brian Griffin is pride. Of all the sin assignments, this one might be the most perfectly executed. Brian considers himself the smartest person in every room. He positions himself as a moral authority, a literary genius, a political philosopher. He lectures other characters on ethics while consistently failing to meet his own standards. He chases women who are too young for him. He writes novels that nobody wants to read. He holds political opinions that he can't defend under pressure. And despite all of this failure and hypocrisy, he never, ever adjusts his self-image downward. Quagmire actually delivers the definitive case for Brian's pride in that famous rant. He calls Brian out for being everything Brian claims to hate. A hypocrite who preaches liberalism but doesn't practice it. A writer who thinks he's talented but has never proven it. A friend who's actually selfish. Brian's pride is so total, so all-encompassing, that even when confronted with the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually is, he can't change. He can't even acknowledge the gap exists. That's not a character flaw, that's a cardinal sin. Stewie Griffin is wrath. The early seasons made this abundantly clear, with Stewie's elaborate plans to murder Lois and dominate the world. His anger was volcanic, disproportionate, and directed at everything around him. He built weapons of mass destruction in response to being served vegetables. He plotted the death of his own mother because she represented authority. Even as Stewie has softened over the years, the wrath is still there, just redirected. He's cruel to Meg. He's casually violent toward people who annoy him. He pushed a classmate down the stairs hard enough to warrant a visit to a psychologist. The anger never left Stewie. He just learned to express it in less apocalyptic ways. Chris Griffin is sloth. This is perhaps the saddest mapping because sloth isn't dramatic or exciting. It's the absence of effort. Chris is perpetually unmotivated. He doesn't try in school. He doesn't pursue hobbies with any real dedication. He doesn't work to improve himself or his circumstances. He sits, he watches television, he eats, and he exists. There's nothing malicious about Chris's sin. He's not hurting anyone. He's just not doing anything. And in a theological framework, that refusal to engage with life, that passive surrender to inertia, is considered just as damning as active wrongdoing. God gave Chris potential, and Chris let it sit in the corner and gather dust. Meg Griffin is envy. Meg wants what everyone else has. She's jealous of popular girls at school. She envies Bonnie Swanson's marriage. She wishes she had a different body, a different family, a different life. In one particularly revealing episode, Meg became so envious of Bonnie's seemingly perfect existence that she actually had Bonnie arrested on fabricated charges, just to tear down someone who had what Meg wanted. Meg's entire emotional landscape is defined by wanting things that are just out of reach, and the pain of watching other people enjoy what she can never have. The most devastating thing about Meg's envy is that it's self-perpetuating. The more she wants, the more she suffers. The more she suffers, the more desperate she becomes. And the more desperate she becomes, the further she pushes away the things she actually desires. Love, acceptance, belonging, all of these slip through Meg's fingers precisely because her need for them is so visible and so intense that it makes the people around her uncomfortable. Envy doesn't just punish Meg, it ensures that the thing she envies will never be hers. The seventh sin, greed, is typically assigned to either Quagmire or Carter Pewterschmidt, depending on which version of the theory you follow. Quagmire's interpretation is interesting because his greed is framed as the insatiable accumulation of sexual conquests, treating human beings as resources to be consumed. But Carter fits the traditional definition more cleanly. He's a billionaire who uses his wealth to control everyone around him. He manipulates Lois. He despises Peter. He hoards resources while contributing nothing positive to the community. Carter's greed isn't about money, it's about power, and he'll spend any amount of the former to maintain the latter. The theological implications of this theory are staggering when you think about them. If each character represents a deadly sin, then the floating timeline of Family Guy isn't lazy writing. It's structural theology. The characters never change, because they can't change. They are their sins. Peter will always consume too much. Brian will always think too highly of himself. Meg will always want what she doesn't have. They're not characters who happen to have these traits. They are the embodiment of these traits in human form. The status quo reset that happens at the end of every episode isn't a limitation of the sitcom format. It's the nature of sin itself. These vices are eternal, unchangeable, hardwired into the fabric of the character's existence. No matter what happens during an episode, no matter what lesson seems to be learned, the sin reasserts itself by the credits. Because sin doesn't get cured, it gets managed at best. And in Quahog, nobody is managing anything. The cutaways take on a role in this framework too. They're temptations, brief, seductive diversions that pull the characters away from whatever they should be paying attention to. Every cutaway is a moment where a character gives in to distraction, surrenders to impulse, chooses the easy pleasure over the difficult reality. It's the theological equivalent of the devil whispering in your ear, and the characters fall for it every single time. If Family Guy is secretly a morality play about the 7 deadly sins, then 25 years of episodes aren't just entertainment, they're a sermon, and the congregation has been laughing along the whole time without realising they're sitting in church. Now we've reached the final theory, and this one is different from all the others. Because this one isn't about the characters, it's about the man who created them, and it involves one of the most traumatic events in modern American history. On September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11. That was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. Every single person on that plane died. Seth MacFarlane was booked on that flight. He had a ticket. He was supposed to be heading from Boston to Los Angeles, but his travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. Some accounts say he was also hungover from a night out in Providence the evening before. Whatever the combination of factors, MacFarlane arrived at Logan Airport after the gate had closed. He missed the flight by minutes, That morning, the passengers and crew who boarded Flight 11 were all killed. The plane was hijacked shortly after takeoff and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. And Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, should have been among them. In subsequent interviews, MacFarlane was asked how this near-death experience affected him. His response was telling. He expressed that it really hadn't affected him significantly. He explained that he was unaware of the danger until hours after the attacks, so it never felt real to him. He didn't know he was on a doomed flight until the rest of the world told him. Psychologists would call this response textbook compartmentalization. When a person survives something so overwhelming that their mind can't process it, they often minimize the experience. They tell themselves and others that it wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't really affect them. They're fine, they move on. But the trauma doesn't disappear. It goes underground, and it starts leaking out in other ways. The theory argues that Family Guy, particularly post-2005 Family Guy, is how MacFarlane's survivor's guilt manifests. He can't directly address the fact that he was supposed to die on September 11th, so instead he processes it through his art, through the show that he was already creating when the attacks happened. Look at how death functions in Family Guy. Death is literally a character, a recurring guest who shows up regularly and interacts with the Griffin family like a neighbour or a co-worker. Death on Family Guy isn't scary. He's awkward, kind of pathetic, relatable. He has dating problems. He has a demanding boss. He's just a guy doing a job. What kind of person turns death into a bumbling cartoon character? Someone who needs to defuse the terror of mortality. Someone who came so close to dying that the only way to cope is to make death itself seem ridiculous and harmless. Death in Family Guy is also temporary and reversible. Characters die and come back constantly. Brian was killed and resurrected within 2 episodes. Peter has survived things that would kill a real person thousands of times over. Stewie's time machine makes death functionally meaningless because you can always go back and undo it. For a man who narrowly escaped a flight where everyone else died permanently, irreversibly, with no second chances, creating a world where death has no real power is the ultimate act of psychological self-defense. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode from Season 8 is one of the most personal things MacFarlane has ever written. In it, Brian reveals that he keeps a loaded gun for the day when life becomes unbearable. That episode was created during a period when MacFarlane was dealing with his mother's cancer diagnosis. But fans who know about the 9/11 connection see another layer. Brian, MacFarlane's self-insert character, carrying around the means of his own death, could be an expression of survivor's guilt. The subconscious feeling that he should have died on that plane. The weight of being alive when everyone else in his row was killed. In Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, the direct-to-DVD movie, Stewie has a near-death experience after an explosion and then uses time travel to explore what his future might look like. The structure of the story, brush with death followed by desperate examination of what life could have been, mirrors what MacFarlane must have experienced in the weeks and months after 9/11. He survived something he shouldn't have, and then he had to figure out what to do with the life he wasn't supposed to still have. The Season 10 episode. Back to the Pilot contains one of the most direct references to 9/11 in the entire series. In it, Brian travels back to the year 2000 and decides to prevent the September 11th attacks. He succeeds, the towers never fall, the attacks never happen. But when Brian and Stewie return to the present, they find that the world is worse. Far worse. Without 9/11 as a unifying event, society fractured. Civil war broke out. The timeline became an apocalyptic wasteland. Brian has to go back again and allow the attacks to happen in order to restore the world. Think about what that storyline is really saying. It's saying you can't undo this. It's saying that even though the attacks were horrific, trying to erase them creates something worse. It's saying that the world we live in, painful and imperfect as it is, exists because of what happened that day, and changing it would destroy everything. For a man who survived 9/11, writing an episode where a character prevents 9/11 and discovers it makes things worse is an extraordinary act of processing through art. MacFarlane is telling himself through his show that the world he lives in, the world where he survived and others didn't, is the world that has to exist, even though it hurts. The season 11 episode, Turban Cowboy, was pulled from broadcast after the Boston Marathon bombing because it contained jokes about terrorism. Fox yanked the episode immediately. But think about the pattern. MacFarlane keeps writing jokes about terrorism. He keeps touching the subject that nearly killed him. He keeps circling back to the thing that should have ended his life. In psychology, this is called repetition compulsion, the tendency for trauma survivors to unconsciously recreate or reference their traumatic experience because their mind is trying to master it. Each terrorism reference, each casual mention, each episode that brushes up against the reality of that day is MacFarlane's psyche trying to process something it never fully processed. The overall tone of Family Guy changed after MacFarlane's near-death experience. The show became darker, more nihilistic, more willing to cross lines that the pre-cancellation seasons wouldn't have touched. Some of that is natural creative evolution, but some of it might be the perspective shift that comes from staring at death and walking away. When you survive something that should have killed you, the rules change. Things that used to seem important seem trivial. Boundaries that used to feel solid feel arbitrary. And the impulse to push limits, to test how far you can go, to laugh at things that shouldn't be funny, becomes overwhelming. Because if none of it mattered enough to stop a plane full of people from dying on a Tuesday morning, then why does any of it matter at all? MacFarlane's survivor's guilt theory doesn't suggest he's broken or damaged. It suggests he's human. He experienced something that no person can fully process, and he's been working through it the only way he knows how. Through comedy, through his characters, through a silly cartoon about a dumb guy, and his talking dog, and his genius baby that has quietly become one of the most complex emotional processing engines in the history of American television. Every Family Guy episode is in some way Seth MacFarlane sitting in a room and trying to figure out why he's still alive. And the answer he keeps coming back to, episode after episode, season after season, is that he's still here because he has stories to tell, even if those stories look like fart jokes and chicken fights on the surface. Underneath, they're the work of a man who was supposed to die at 27 and somehow didn't. A man who has spent the past 25 years trying to make something worthy of the time he was given. And maybe that's the darkest theory of all. Not that Peter is in a mental institution. Not that Quahog is purgatory. Not that Stewie is a traumatized child hiding behind a fake accent. But that the entire show exists because a travel agent gave a man the wrong departure time on a Tuesday morning in September, and a random act of human error is the only reason any of this exists at all. Family Guy, the show, the characters, the universe, all of it rests on 15 minutes. If Seth MacFarlane had been 15 minutes earlier to the airport that morning, there would be no Peter Griffin. No Stewie, no Brian, no Giggity, no chicken fights, no cutaways. Over 2 decades of television, and one of the most recognisable animated shows in history exists because of 15 minutes. That's the theory that stays with you, not the fictional ones about purgatory and demons and contaminated water, but the real one. The one where a missed alarm clock is the only thing standing between us and a world where Family Guy never existed. So we've covered 13 theories now, 13 different ways to look at a show that most people write off as just a bunch of random jokes strung together. But before we wrap this up, I want to do something I think is really important. I want to talk about how these theories connect to each other. Because when you start laying them out side by side, something really eerie happens. They don't just coexist, they reinforce each other. They build on each other in ways that make the whole picture far more unsettling than any single theory on its own. Let's start with the big picture. If Peter is in a mental institution, imagining the whole show, then every other theory we discussed is happening inside his delusion. The CIA experiment on Brian? That's how Peter's broken mind explains why his imaginary dog can talk. Stewie's fake accent and constructed personality? That's Peter creating a rich inner world for the son who was never born, complete with psychological complexity that Peter's subconscious mind is sophisticated enough to generate, even if Peter himself isn't. The purgatory theory? Maybe Peter's guilt over his family's death is so overwhelming that even within his delusion, he can't create a world that feels like paradise. He creates purgatory instead, because he doesn't believe he deserves heaven. The Stewie perception theory and the Peter institution theory are actually compatible in a deeply disturbing way. If you accept that the show is Peter's delusion, then the version of Stewie we see is Peter's fantasy of his unborn son. But within that fantasy, Stewie perceives the world his own way. So we're watching a baby's perception of a world that only exists inside a grieving father's imagination. That's layers upon layers of unreliable narration. We're not just one step removed from reality, we're multiple steps removed. The real world of Family Guy might be 4 or 5 layers deep in fiction. And the thing that started it all is a man sitting in a room somewhere, unable to accept that his family's gone. If Brian is writing the show, as Theory 11 suggests, then he's writing it from within Peter's delusion. Brian doesn't exist in reality. He's a figment of Peter's imagination, who's been given enough artificial intelligence, or enough of Peter's own intelligence projected onto him, to become self-aware within the fantasy. Brian writing Family Guy isn't an author documenting his world. It's a fragment of Peter's consciousness, trying to make sense of its own existence from inside the dream. The 7 deadly sins theory maps perfectly onto the purgatory theory. If Quahog is the afterlife, then the sin assignments aren't just thematic analysis. They're the actual reason each character is trapped there. Peter's gluttony got him condemned. Brian's pride damned him. Meg's envy is her eternal sentence. They're not just symbolic representations of vice. They are the vices themselves, made flesh and imprisoned in a town that serves as both their punishment and their prison. The Lake Quahog contamination theory and the post-cancellation multiverse theory can be understood as 2 sides of the same coin. The characters changed after 2005 either because they crossed into a different universe or because the water started poisoning their brains. But what if both are true? What if the contamination in the water is what opened the dimensional rift in the first place? Chemical contamination affecting the fabric of reality itself, weakening the barriers between parallel dimensions and allowing a darker version of the Family Guy universe to bleed into the original one. That would explain why the shift happened gradually rather than all at once. The contamination was slowly corroding the walls between worlds, and by the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The original Griffins were gone, replaced by their darker counterparts from Universe B. Quagmire being a supernatural entity makes even more sense when you combine it with the purgatory theory. If everyone in Quahog is dead and trapped in the afterlife, Quagmire could be the demon assigned to test them. His impossible age, his supernatural resilience, his ability to survive anything. These aren't just quirks of a cartoon character. They're the attributes of a being that was never human to begin with. Quagmire doesn't age because demons don't age. He survives everything because you can't kill something that isn't alive. And his relentless sexual predation is his function in purgatory. He's there to tempt, to corrupt, to make sure the souls around him keep failing their tests. The Meg is Stewie's mother theory gains another layer when you connect it to the Spooner Street trauma theory. If Meg gave birth to Stewie as a teenager and the family covered it up, that secret would be a source of enormous psychological pressure on every member of the household. Peter and Lois would carry the guilt of taking their daughter's child and erasing her motherhood. Meg would carry the trauma of having her son raised as her brother. And Stewie, if he ever figured it out, would carry the rage of knowing his entire family structure is built on a lie. The accumulated trauma that the Spooner Street theory documents isn't random bad luck. It's the inevitable fallout of a family with a catastrophic secret at its core. Everything that goes wrong for the Griffins can be traced back to the moment they decided to pretend Meg's baby was Lois's. Stewie's dissociative identity, his constructed persona with the fake British accent, might be his subconscious response to sensing the truth about his origins. Babies are remarkably perceptive. They pick up on emotional undercurrents that adults think they're hiding. If the Griffin household is poisoned by this massive secret, a genius-level infant might respond by creating an elaborate fictional identity to cope with the feelings of wrongness he can't articulate. Stewie knows something is off. He doesn't know what, so he builds a character so powerful, so brilliant, so in control that nothing about his real circumstances can touch him. The fake accent isn't just coping with being an outcast at preschool, it's coping with the fundamental lie at the centre of his existence. And then there's Seth MacFarlane, sitting behind all of this, processing his own brush with death through the very act of creation. If the 9/11 survivors' guilt theory is true, then every dark theory we've discussed is filtered through the sensibility of a man who has an altered relationship with mortality. The death and resurrection tropes throughout Family Guy, the casual violence, the floating timeline where nobody permanently dies, the character of Death himself being played for laughs, all of it becomes the creative output of someone who knows firsthand how thin the line between life and death actually is. MacFarlane creates a world where death is temporary, because in the real world, for him, death was something that passed by close enough to feel its breath on his neck. He responded by building a universe where it could never touch him or anyone he cares about. Think about what Family Guy really is when you stack all of these theories together. It's a show about dead people in purgatory who represent the 7 deadly sins. Narrated by a CIA experiment dog who's writing the whole thing, filtered through the perception of a genius baby with a fake identity, inside the delusion of a grieving father in a mental institution, created by a man who should have died on September 11th. Each theory alone is disturbing. Together, they form something that's almost incomprehensibly layered, a Russian nesting doll of sadness and trauma, an unreality that goes deeper every time you think you've reached the bottom. And the wildest part? None of them are technically wrong. Every single one of these theories can be supported by actual evidence from the show. Real episodes, real quotes, real moments that the writers put in front of millions of viewers. Whether they intended any of these interpretations or not, the evidence is there. It exists. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Let me tell you something about Family Guy that I think most people don't appreciate. This show has been on the air for over 25 years now. 24 seasons and counting. Over 450 episodes. It was cancelled and brought back from the dead, which, given the theories we've discussed tonight, is almost too on the nose. It survived the cancellation wave of the early 2000s. It survived the rise of streaming and the decline of network television. It survived every controversy, every call for cancellation, every think piece about whether it had gone too far. And throughout all of that, people kept watching. Not just watching, analysing, dissecting, building elaborate theories about what's really happening beneath the surface of a show that, on its face, seems designed to be the least serious thing on television. There's something beautiful about that, if you think about it. Seth MacFarlane created a show about a stupid guy doing stupid things, and people responded by finding extraordinary depth in it. They found theology, they found psychology, they found meta-commentary on the nature of authorship and reality. They found trauma narratives and family secrets and explorations of grief that are as complex as anything in prestige television. Maybe that's the real theory. Not that the show is secretly about any one dark thing, but that it's built in such a way that it becomes a mirror. People look at Family Guy and they see whatever they need to see. If you're interested in psychology, you see the Stewie dissociative identity theory. If you're interested in theology, you see the 7 deadly sins. If you're interested in conspiracy, you see the CIA experiments and the contaminated water. The show accommodates all of these readings because it's broad enough, deep enough, and strange enough to support virtually any interpretation. That's either the sign of a show that's secretly genius, or a show that's so chaotic that meaning can be projected onto it like light onto a blank wall. And honestly, I'm not sure which answer is more interesting. Let me leave you with one final thought. We talked earlier about how nothing in Family Guy ever permanently changes. The status quo resets, the characters snap back to baseline. The floating timeline ensures that nobody ages, nobody grows, nobody learns. And we've discussed several theories for why that is. Purgatory, delusion, chemical contamination, theological sin. But maybe the simplest explanation is also the most unsettling one. Maybe nothing in Quahog changes because the characters are choosing not to change. They've been given every opportunity. They've been through every imaginable scenario. They've died and come back. They've travelled through time. They've seen alternate realities where things are better. And every single time, they return to exactly who they were before. Peter goes back to being Peter. Brian goes back to being Brian. Meg goes back to absorbing abuse. Stewie goes back to his fake accent and his inventions. Not because they're trapped, not because they're in purgatory, not because they're being poisoned, but because change is the scariest thing in the world. Change means admitting you were wrong. Change means facing the things about yourself that you've been avoiding. Change means becoming someone new. And becoming someone new means letting the old version of yourself die. And in a world where death is a recurring character who shows up at your door like a FedEx driver, maybe the Griffins have decided that the devil they know is better than the unknown they'd have to face if they actually committed to being different. Every reset isn't a narrative convention. It's a choice. It's the characters looking at the possibility of growth and saying no thank you. I'll stay broken. I'll stay in Quahog. I'll keep doing the same things and making the same mistakes and hurting the same people and being hurt in the same ways. Because at least this pain is familiar. At least this version of hell is one I understand. And if that sounds like it could apply to more than just a cartoon, well, that might be the darkest theory of all. So those are the most disturbing Family Guy theories that fans have put together over 25 years of watching this show. Some of them are wild speculation. Some of them are backed by actual evidence from actual episodes. And one of them, the one about Seth MacFarlane and September 11th, is built on events that actually happened in the real world. Here's what I'll say. Family Guy has always been treated as the lowest common denominator of animated comedy. The show that goes for cheap laughs. The show with no depth. The show that's all surface and no substance. But after spending hours researching these theories, reading the Reddit threads, watching the key episodes, and putting the pieces together, I don't think that's true at all. I think Family Guy might be one of the most layered shows in television history, even if most of those layers were never intentional. A show that can generate this level of analysis and interpretation isn't shallow, it's a mirror. And what you see in it says as much about you as it does about the show itself. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. We have a lot more deep dives like this one coming soon. Sweet dreams. Actually, before we go, let me bring up one more thing that I've been thinking about while putting all of this together. There's something about the structure of Family Guy that makes it uniquely suited for this kind of dark theory analysis. And I don't think it's an accident. Most animated comedies have a clear emotional core. The Simpsons, at its best, is about the love between a flawed family. Bob's Burgers is about a family that genuinely likes each other despite their circumstances. Even South Park, for all its transgressive content, has clear moral frameworks that the audience can anchor to. Family Guy is different. Its emotional core is unstable. It shifts from episode to episode, sometimes from scene to scene. One moment, Peter is telling Meg he loves her. The next, he's pretending she doesn't exist. One moment, Brian is having a genuine emotional breakthrough. The next, he's doing something that contradicts everything he just said. That instability is what makes these dark theories so compelling, because when a show doesn't have a consistent emotional truth, the audience starts searching for one. They start looking underneath the surface for the real story that explains why everything feels so off. If Peter's love for his family seems inconsistent, it's because he's in an institution and his delusion has cracks. If the show's tone swings wildly between genuine emotion and cruel comedy, it's because the characters are in purgatory and the rules of reality don't apply. If nothing makes coherent emotional sense, it's because a baby is perceiving everything, and babies don't understand emotional coherence yet. Family Guy's inconsistency isn't a bug, it's the feature that spawns every theory on this list. A perfectly consistent show doesn't need dark theories to explain it. A show that contradicts itself every other episode practically demands them. And maybe Seth MacFarlane knows this. Maybe the inconsistency is deliberate, designed to create exactly the kind of interpretive gap that theories rush to fill. Maybe Family Guy is the most elaborate Rorschach test in entertainment history, a show that gives you just enough contradictory information to make you see whatever hidden pattern your mind is predisposed to find. Or maybe it really is just a dumb cartoon about a fat guy in Rhode Island, and we're all overthinking it. But where's the fun in that? Okay, for real this time. Thanks for watching. If you've stuck with us through all 13 theories, you're a champion. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and seriously, sweet dreams. You're going to need them after this one. Let me tell you one last thing about Quahog before you drift off. The town's name comes from Quahog clams, which are native to Rhode Island. These clams can live for over 200 years. They sit at the bottom of the ocean, buried in mud, filtering the same water over and over and over again for centuries. They never move. They never change. They just exist in the same spot, doing the same thing, day after day after day, for longer than any human being could survive. Sound familiar? Sleep well. But actually, if you're still listening, let me add something that's been nagging at me about the Peter mental institution theory. We talked about how Peter created the whole Family Guy world inside his head. But there's one detail that fans keep coming back to that we didn't fully explore. The theory suggests that every character Peter invented in his fantasy is built from fragments of his real life. Characters he encountered before the accident, things he saw on television, faces from his childhood. And this leads to a fascinating question. What about characters who seem completely random? Herbert, the elderly neighbour, who's creepily obsessed with Chris. If Peter is imagining Herbert, what part of Peter's psyche does Herbert represent? Some fans think Herbert is a distorted memory of someone Peter encountered in his childhood, possibly an inappropriate authority figure, or a stranger who made Peter uncomfortable as a kid. Peter's mind dredges up that unease and manifests it as a character who hovers around his son, embodying every parent's worst fear about the people who live next door. Ollie Williams, the hyperactive news anchor who delivers weather reports in a single shouted sentence. If Peter is creating the news media of his imaginary world, Ollie might represent how Peter actually processes information. Short bursts, simple sentences, no nuance. Peter's imaginary newsroom is staffed by reporters who communicate the way Peter's brain processes reality, in fragments and exclamations, because that's all his damaged mind can sustain. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the news anchors who spend more time in petty conflicts than actually reporting news. In Peter's fantasy, the media is just as dysfunctional as his family. This might be Peter projecting his distrust of institutions onto the information gatekeepers of his invented world. He doesn't trust the news even in his imagination because he's learned, through the trauma that put him in the institution, that the real world cannot be trusted. Even the chicken, Peter's recurring arch nemesis, with whom he engages in city-destroying fight sequences, might have a meaning within the institutional theory. The fights with the chicken follow the same pattern every time. They erupt from nothing. They escalate to apocalyptic proportions. They end inconclusively, and then the chicken comes back, over and over and over. If Peter is in a mental institution, the chicken fights might represent his struggle with his own psychosis. The chicken is the intrusive thought, the unwanted mental pattern that keeps returning, no matter how many times he tries to defeat it. Each fight is Peter battling his own illness, and each fight ends the same way, because you don't defeat mental illness. You just survive the latest round and wait for it to come back. The recurring nature of the chicken fights maps perfectly onto the experience of chronic mental health episodes. The patient has periods of stability. Then a trigger appears, something as minor as a coupon dispute, which is literally what started the first chicken fight. The trigger sets off a cascade of destructive behaviour that consumes everything around the patient. Eventually, the episode subsides. The patient returns to baseline, and then it happens again. The fact that the chicken fights always start with something trivial is the most realistic detail in the entire theory. Mental health crises don't always start with dramatic catalysts. Sometimes they start with a bad coupon. Sometimes they start with nothing at all. If you've been paying attention, you might have noticed that virtually every theory on this list returns to the same fundamental theme: pain. Every interpretation of Family Guy, no matter how creative or how bizarre, ultimately comes back to the idea that something is deeply wrong and someone is suffering because of it. Peter is grieving, Stewie is frightened, Brian is trapped, Meg is sacrificing herself, McFarlane is processing mortality. The residents of Quahog are being poisoned, punished, or both. Maybe that's why these theories resonate so powerfully with fans. Not because they're necessarily true, but because they reframe a show that's famous for not caring about anything into a show that's secretly about caring too much. About feeling things so intensely that the only way to survive is to bury those feelings under layers and layers of absurdist comedy and hope that nobody digs deep enough to find what's underneath. But people did dig, and what they found was this: 13 theories, 25 years of evidence, hundreds of episodes containing clues that may or may not have been placed there intentionally. And at the centre of all of it, a simple truth that connects every dark interpretation of Family Guy to every other one. Everybody in Quahog is broken, and nobody in Quahog knows how to fix it. Not Peter, not Lois, not Stewie, not Brian, not Meg, not Cleveland, not Joe, not even Quagmire, if he's human enough to be broken in the first place. They're all just sitting there, in the same town, on the same street, doing the same things, day after day, season after season, year after year, like Quahog clams at the bottom of the ocean, filtering the same water, going nowhere, changing nothing, buried alive and calling it home. Good night, everybody. Let me take a moment to talk about some specific episodes that fans keep bringing up in connection with these theories. Because the details in these episodes are what separates casual speculation from genuinely convincing analysis. There's an episode from season 4 called The Fat Guy Strangler, where Lois discovers she has a long-lost brother named Patrick who has been institutionalized for decades. Patrick was committed to a mental hospital because he witnessed something traumatic as a child involving his mother and Jackie Gleason. He spent his entire adult life locked away, and when Lois finally gets him released, he becomes a serial killer targeting overweight men. Peter is nearly one of his victims. On the surface, this is just a dark comedy episode, but in the context of the Peter mental institution theory, it's devastating. Peter's show, his fantasy, contains a character who is placed in a mental institution. Peter's imagination is drawing from his own reality. He's subconsciously populating his fictional world with references to institutionalization, because that's where he actually is. He can't fully suppress the truth of his situation, so it leaks into his delusion as a family member who shares his fate. And the fact that Patrick becomes violent after being released is Peter's subconscious telling himself that leaving the institution would be dangerous. Staying in the fantasy is safer than facing the real world. There's another episode that theory fans obsess over. In Season 4's Petarded, Peter takes an IQ test and scores so low that he's officially classified as mentally disabled. The town of Quahog declares him mentally incompetent, and Lois is given legal guardianship over him. She's effectively declared his caretaker, responsible for a man who cannot take care of himself. In the show, this is played for comedy. Peter abuses his newfound status to behave even more recklessly than usual. But if Peter is actually in a mental institution, this episode is a crack in the facade so large you could drive a truck through it. His fantasy world is literally declaring him mentally incompetent. His own delusion is trying to tell him the truth about himself, and he's so deep in the psychosis that he experiences this revelation as just another wacky adventure. The episode where Stewie and Brian get locked in a bank vault deserves another look too. We've mentioned it several times tonight because it keeps being relevant to different theories, and that's not a coincidence. This episode, Brian and Stewie from Season 8, is the most thematically dense episode in the entire series. It's the only episode with no cutaway gags, no B-plot, no other characters, just two voices in a sealed room, talking about the things that matter most to them. Brian admits to the gun. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian. They discuss mortality. They discuss purpose. They discuss what it means to be alive and whether life is worth living. This is the episode that every major theory circles back to, because it's the one episode where the characters are stripped of all their defences. There are no cutaways to escape into, no Peter antics to distract from the emotional weight, no other characters to absorb the tension. It's just the raw truth of two characters who might not be what they appear to be, locked in a room with nowhere to hide. If Brian is a CIA experiment, this is a human mind trapped in a dog's body, confessing that it's been contemplating suicide. If Stewie has dissociative identity, this is a brief moment where the real child almost surfaces before the fake identity pulls him back under. If Brian is writing the show, this is the author dropping the pen and admitting to his own creation that he's not okay. If they're in purgatory, this is two trapped souls having a genuine moment of connection in a place designed to prevent exactly that. Every theory makes this episode more powerful, and every repeat viewing reveals something new. There's also the matter of the Star Wars trilogy episodes. Family Guy devoted 3 full episode-length specials to retelling the original Star Wars trilogy with Family Guy characters substituted in. Peter is Han Solo, Chris is Luke Skywalker, Stewie is Darth Vader, Lois is Princess Leia, Brian is Chewbacca. These casting choices, which seem like obvious surface-level comedy assignments, actually reveal a lot about how the characters see themselves and each other. Peter casting himself as the roguish, lovable smuggler who saves the galaxy and gets the girl is pure wish fulfillment. He wants to be the hero. He wants to be cool, charming, and indispensable. In reality, Peter is none of these things. But in his fantasy, within a fantasy, he finally gets to be the man he always wished he was. Chris as Luke Skywalker, the unlikely hero who discovers hidden greatness within himself, is Peter's hope for his son. He wants Chris to be destined for something greater, even though every piece of evidence suggests otherwise. Stewie as Darth Vader is the most telling casting of all. Vader is a villain who is eventually redeemed. a man consumed by anger and darkness, who finds his way back to the light in the final act. If you believe the dissociative identity theory, then Stewie casting himself as Vader is a subconscious roadmap for his own character arc. He knows deep down that the villain persona isn't who he really is. He knows that redemption is possible, but like Vader, he needs to go through hell before he can take the mask off. And Brian as Chewbacca is brutally perfect. Chewbacca is loyal, intelligent, and brave, but he communicates in a language that most people can't understand. He's valued by those closest to him, but treated as an animal by the wider galaxy. He can never fully participate in human society, despite being one of the most capable individuals in any room. If Brian is a CIA experiment with a human mind in a dog's body, then casting him as Chewbacca isn't just comedy, it's a confession. There are other episodes worth mentioning in this context too. The viewer mail specials, where the show tells anthology stories based on viewer letters, often contain some of the most unhinged and surreal content in the entire series. In one segment, Peter gains reality warping powers and uses them to reshape Quahog according to his whims. In another, the family becomes a different form of media entirely. These episodes break the format so completely that they feel like glimpses behind the curtain. They feel like the machinery of whatever is really going on. In Family Guy briefly becoming visible before the regular fictioner reasserts itself. One more episode connection that I think ties several theories together beautifully. In the Season 6 episode Macstroke, Peter suffers a stroke after eating at a fast food restaurant. The stroke temporarily alters his personality, making him more patient, more thoughtful, and more emotionally available to his family. Lois and the kids actually prefer stroke victim Peter to normal Peter. He's a better father, a better husband, a better person. And then the stroke's effects wear off, and Peter reverts to his usual self. The family is visibly disappointed. If you combine the contamination theory with the Spooner Street trauma theory, this episode becomes a medical case study. The stroke temporarily overrides the chemical damage that Lake Quahog's polluted water has been doing to Peter's brain. For a brief window, his frontal lobe function is restored, and we get to see what Peter would be like without years of neurotoxin exposure. He's kind, he's present, he's capable of love, and then the damage reasserts itself, and the Peter we know comes back. The family's disappointment isn't played as a joke in this reading. It's a community watching one of its members briefly recover from environmental poisoning before the illness inevitably returns. These kinds of episode-by-episode connections are what make the Family Guy theory community so dedicated. Every time someone rewatches an episode with one of these frameworks in mind, they find new evidence, new details, new moments that seem to confirm what they suspected. The show is so dense, so packed with throwaway lines and background gags and character moments that fly by in seconds, that the well of supporting evidence never seems to run dry. For every theory we discussed tonight, there are dozens more episode references that fans have catalogued and cross-referenced across decades of content. The question that all of this raises, the one that I don't think anyone can definitively answer, is whether any of this was intentional. Did Seth MacFarlane design these characters around the 7 deadly sins? Did the writer's room deliberately plant clues about Meg being Stewie's mother? Does anyone at Fox know that their longest-running animated comedy can be read as a theological treatise on purgatory? Probably not. Almost certainly not, in fact. The simplest explanation is that Family Guy is a show written by rotating teams of writers over 25 years, and the sheer volume of content inevitably creates patterns that were never planned. When you produce 450 plus episodes of anything, you're going to generate enough material for an army of theorists to find connections in. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter whether it was intentional or not, the patterns are there, the evidence exists, The theories hold up under scrutiny, not perfectly, but well enough to be genuinely compelling. And the fact that a mindless animated comedy has generated this level of intellectual engagement from its audience is itself a kind of brilliance, whether it was planned or accidental. Family Guy is 25 years old now. It's been on the air longer than most of its viewers have been alive. It's survived cancellation, controversy, cultural shifts, and the complete transformation of how people consume media. And it's still generating new theories, new analysis, new ways of seeing what's always been there. Maybe the show deserves more credit than it gets, or maybe it deserves exactly the credit it gets, and the theories are just fans finding depth where none exists. Either way, the conversation is more interesting than the answer. Alright, that's genuinely the end this time. Thanks for sticking around through the whole thing. If you made it this far, you are a real one. Hit subscribe, hit that bell, and get some rest. You've earned it. Sweet dreams, Quahog. Sweet dreams. Actually, you know what? There are 2 more episodes I want to touch on before we truly close this out, because I think they're the key to understanding why Family Guy is such fertile ground for dark theories. The very first episode of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow, from season 1, sets up something that most people don't think about. In the pilot, Peter loses his job at the toy factory, lies to Lois about it, and accidentally ends up getting welfare checks worth more than his salary. He showers the family in money. He buys a car, a boat, and all kinds of ridiculous things. When Lois finally discovers the truth, Peter has to give back all the money at the Super Bowl, where he drops welfare checks from a blimp onto a stadium full of people. It's a simple setup, typical sitcom pilot stuff. But look at the structure through the lens of what we've discussed tonight. In the very first episode, Peter creates a false reality to protect himself from a painful truth. He constructs a fantasy life built on lies, and when that fantasy is threatened, he tries to maintain it through increasingly desperate measures. When it finally collapses, the fallout is public and humiliating. But by the next episode, everything resets. Peter has his job back. The family is fine. The consequences evaporate. The entire DNA of the show, and every dark theory built around it, is encoded in that first episode. A man who builds a fantasy to escape pain. A world where consequences don't stick. A reset button that erases everything and puts everyone back to baseline. If you wanted to write a pilot that secretly establishes that the main character is delusional, or that the world operates on purgatorial logic, or that nothing the audience sees is real, you couldn't do it any better than Death Has a Shadow. The title itself is a clue. Death has a shadow. It's always nearby, it's always watching, but it never steps into the light. And then there's Road to the Multiverse from season 8, which might be the most important mythology episode in the entire series. This is the episode where Stewie shows Brian his multiverse remote control, and they hop between alternate realities. They visit a universe where the roles of dogs and humans are reversed, and Brian experiences what it's like to be treated as a pet. They visit a universe drawn in Disney animation style, complete with musical numbers and woodland creatures. They visit a world where Christianity never existed, and as a result, civilization is 1,000 years more technologically advanced. Each of these alternate realities reveals something about how the characters see themselves and their world. The dog-human role reversal is particularly significant for the Brian theories. When Brian experiences life as the dominant species, he's finally treated with the dignity he's always craved. He walks upright. He wears clothes that fit. People listen to him and respect his opinions. And then he has to go back to a world where he eats from a bowl on the floor and gets scolded for jumping on furniture. That's not just a funny alternate reality. That's a sentient being being shown what his life should feel like, and then having it taken away. If Brian has a human brain in a dog's body, Road to the Multiverse is the cruelest episode in the series, because it shows him exactly what he's missing, and then forces him back into the cage. The fact that the multiverse is canon in Family Guy means that every theory we've discussed tonight could be simultaneously true in different realities. There's a universe where Peter is in a mental institution. There's a universe where Quahog is purgatory. There's a universe where the water is poisoned, and one where it isn't. There's a universe where Meg is Stewie's mother, and one where she isn't. The multiverse doesn't invalidate any theory, it validates all of them. Every interpretation exists somewhere in the infinite expanse of parallel dimensions that the show itself has confirmed are real. That's the genius of Family Guy's mythology, whether it was planned or accidental. By establishing that infinite realities exist, the show created a framework where literally anything is possible, and no interpretation can be definitively ruled out. Every fan theory, no matter how dark or how absurd, has a home somewhere in the multiverse. And the version of the show we watch every week might be any one of those realities. We have no way of knowing which one we're looking at, because the characters themselves might not know which reality they're in. So when you're lying there tonight, drifting off to sleep, and your mind starts replaying the theories we talked about, just remember, somewhere in the multiverse, every single one of them is happening right now. Somewhere, Peter is sitting in a white room, imagining his family is still alive. Somewhere, Quagmire is shedding his human skin when nobody's watching. Somewhere, Stewie is speaking in his real voice, and nobody is there to hear it. And somewhere, Seth MacFarlane is sitting at his gate at Logan Airport, watching a clock that reads 7:45 a.m. And he's about to make a flight that will take him somewhere he can never come back from. But not in our universe. In our universe, he missed the flight. And we got 25 years of a show that, whether it's genius or garbage or something miraculous in between, has given millions of people something to think about, something to analyse, something to argue about, something to listen to while they fall asleep on a quiet night, wondering what's really happening in a little town in Rhode Island where a fat man and his talking dog and his genius baby have been living the same day over and over and over for a quarter of a century. Good night, everyone. For real this time. Good night, Quahog.